It's good to be back. Good to see all of you. It's been a couple of years since I've been here, and I'm blessed that Pastor Israel invited me to come. I can't believe it's been 9 years already that God has brought you together as a church, and the amazing things that have taken place in this church, and the lives that have been changed. The Philippines has been impacted. The community of Vegas has been impacted. It's a very cool thing to watch what God's doing when a local church has leaders that love Him and take His word seriously. I think that's what I'm saying here. I'm blessed to have my wife with me this time. A lot of times she's not here, so my wife Melanie is here. And for the first time, my son and his wife and two of my grandkids are here too. Travis, stand up there. Here visiting too. And actually, Travis and Liz are going to the Philippines in April. I think most of you know that we lived in Cebu for 5.5 years, from 1987 to 1993. Travis was 9 when we arrived, and almost 15 when we came back. And it's going to be the first time for him to go back since 1996. And, we're going to talk a little bit about culture here in a minute, but, the bonds that he made with the students that he went to school with from like grade 3 to grade 8 in Cebu, he's maintained contact with all of them through Facebook. And when Travis and Liz go, Liz's first trip to the Philippines, when they go, they're actually having a reunion because they're going to come visiting, and he's going to reconnect with all his old friends and stuff from school in Cebu. And so that's a beautiful thing. Those kinds of connections, and again, it's a cultural thing. That when you are part of an Asian culture, in particular Filipino culture, you really become part of the group. And it's an incredible thing. They just got back from serving 3 years in Central America as missionaries at school out in the jungle in southern Belize, and now they're back and living in Mesquite. And so, blessed to have them here. And I'm blessed to be here. So, praise the Lord. So there's a lot going on this morning. I'm going to be fairly brief as pastors go, which that's the qualifier. So let me pray, and then I'd like to open up God's Word together. Father, thank you for this morning. It is always a blessing, Lord, to come and be with Israel and my brethren here, Lord, at C4, and to see, Lord, the ongoing demonstration of your goodness and your grace in a group of people that take you seriously, that take seriously obeying your word and living it out. And Lord, I believe that that's happening through this church. And Lord, you've sustained them for 9 years. You've demonstrated the truth of what you told Peter in Matthew 16, that the church is what you build. You're its builder, and it's founded on you. And nothing, Lord, can prevail against the church when it is focused and it is built, Lord, by you. And so I thank you for that this morning. And Lord, I pray that as we look at a familiar text, maybe from a little different angle than some have looked at it before, that your Spirit would help us recognize again the importance of culture, the reality of culture, Lord, and the fact that, Lord, you designed us in certain ways, that we really do care about the group that we draw an identity from. So I pray that as I unpack these things, your Spirit would help us to understand. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, open your Bibles to the Gospel of John, chapter 2. The Gospel of John, chapter 2, and we're going to cover a very familiar text to most people that have been in the church for any length of time. We're going to cover the wedding at Cana. And we're going to look at it, though, from a cultural perspective that an American would never see it from, but that somebody from Asia, somebody from the Middle East, somebody from the Philippines, somebody from Africa would immediately recognize what's taking place in this text. And so let me read all the way through it. It's only 10 verses, actually 11 verses. And then we'll go back and we'll take a look at it from, again, a different perspective. It says in chapter 2, verse 1, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother then said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, speaking of the servants, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. Now when the master of the feast had tasted the water that had been made wine, and he didn't know where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water, they knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, what I want to do is I want to walk back through this text, and I want to look at it through a cultural lens that's going to be very familiar to all of you. A cultural lens that your average American born and raised in America would never view this from. But what Jesus viewed it from, and what most of the rest of the world sees when they actually read this text. Now, let me sort of set the backdrop for it first. This this text is significant because it tells us, John tells us, this is the first miracle that Jesus did, right? And he says, not only does he say this is the first miracle, but he says Jesus manifested his glory. He revealed his Godhood. He unpacked his awesomeness through this miracle. And I stumbled over this for years. Of all the miracles Jesus could have done to begin introducing himself with, water and wine? Are you kidding me? That's like too simple. I mean, in the Old Testament, he turned the waters of the Nile to blood. You know, he has the ability to do incredible things above and beyond water to wine, and yet he chose to turn water to wine as his first miracle. And John says in that, he's revealing his glory as God. Hey, water to wine can be done by one of the magicians here in Vegas. Right? David Copperfield would laugh at that. So there has to be something bigger than water to wine going on here. And that's what I want you to see. I want to take you through this and help you see that it's not at all about water to wine. It's not at all about the ability to turn water to wine. It's all about covering someone's shame and increasing their honor in the eyes of the people that matter to them. And in that is a complete picture of the gospel of Jesus Christ for 90% of the people that live on this planet. Now, Western culture, which would be Western Europe, America, and Canada, we are what's called guilt and innocence-based cultures. In Western European culture, Canadian culture, American culture, the individual is the foundation of society. Individual rights, my individual identity, my freedom, my independence, my desire to be whatever I want to be. The foundation of society in Western culture is the individual. In the time of the Bible, everyone on the planet, and throughout 90% of the people that live in this world today, the individual is not the foundational building block of society. The group is. See, Western culture is individualistic. The rest of the world is what we call collectivistic. In other words, they believe that society, the foundation of society, is the group, the immediate family, the extended family, the barangay that you grew up in, the school that you attended, your identity as an individual is not what's the highest priority. It's your identity as part of a group. So it's a collectivistic culture. And this is a very important truth for us to understand because it was the same in the time of Jesus. You see? So in an individualistic culture, we are guilt and innocence based. In other words, we as individuals, we look at laws and standards and we compare ourselves to those standards, and if we haven't violated them, we have a clear conscience, we're not guilty. You see? And so we want to navigate in innocence, but we don't always do that, so we navigate by guilt, this individual feeling that I've violated a rule or a standard, and I'm going to get punished for it. And there's a component of that that's true, that's from God. But the reality of it is that we were wired by God to be collectivistic, primarily, culturally. And in a collectivistic culture, like the Philippines, like Asia, all Asia, most of Africa, all of the Middle East, honor and shame are much more important than guilt and innocence, because honor and shame are, again, the idea that the individual is not the most important, the group is. The only place you see this fully in American culture is in the U.S. military. I was in the Army. I know this brother over here was in the Air Force. Were you in the military? All of us that have been in the military, the U.S. military, basic training exists to crush American culture. The whole reason for basic training is that you cannot have a military built on an individualistic culture. The military can only be what it's called to be and do what it's called to do if you lose your individual identity and are part of a group, a significant part of a group, doing something larger than your own personal interests. The U.S. military is the only place in American culture where honor and shame are close to what God originally designed mankind for. Okay? Are you with me so far?
Amen.
All right. I know there's a lot of kids in here, so I'm trying to keep it, flowing and simple. Okay? Now, one other quick thing before we start looking at this. Understanding these things, weddings in American culture are all about what? Making the bride happy. My youngest daughter got married last year. My second daughter to get married. My other daughter was married 15 years ago. An American girl, the purpose of a wedding is what? Keep the bride happy. In fact, they're so hard to keep happy, they make TV shows about them called Bridezillas. Right? I did a number of weddings in the Philippines. Probably a dozen weddings of Filipinos in the Philippines, and quite a few here in the U.S. A wedding is not in Asia, in the Philippines, about keeping the bride happy. Is it? No. The wedding in the Philippines is about the family and how they're viewed by those that matter to them. A wedding is an opportunity to increase your honor, to heighten your status in the eyes of those you know and love. The bride's wishes are not the primary thing. She gives up her individual right for the good of the family. And if the wedding is done right, everybody that attended goes away with a higher respect, a greater honor bestowed upon the family who did the wedding right. And a wedding done wrong is shameful. Ula in Cebuano, right? I'm trying to... Hila? Is that what it is? In Tagalog, is it Hila?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really know Tagalog too much. Anyway, yeah, right? Shameful. See, when you put on a wedding and you invite a certain amount of people to come, and they're people that you care about, and you care about how they view you, the wedding has to be done a certain way. And if certain things are not done the right way, instead of the wedding increasing the honor of the family, it actually can shame the family. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, so it was for the Jews. So it was for Jesus and his disciples. And so it was so important that a wedding be well planned that in Jewish culture of the day, if you went to a wedding, your friends invited you to a wedding, and you went to the wedding, and they ran out of wine. Wine was a symbol of wealth. If you ran out of wine, your friends could sue you for fraud. Seriously. You can look it up. Jewish culture. Jewish history. If you invite me to your wedding of your daughter or your son, and I go to the wedding, and you run out of wine, you have committed fraud against me, and I can sue you for that. Because you were pretending to be something and to have a certain amount of resources and money that you don't have. You were committing fraud. Now, with that as the backdrop, let's look at this again. Chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now, both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. The first thing to notice is Mary was not invited to the wedding. She was friends of the family. Mary was at this wedding. She had a deep connection with this family, whoever the family was. And she cared about this family. And so she's going to love this family by being present and serving, doing those mundane tasks to make sure the wedding goes well for this family that she loves. So Mary was at the wedding, but notice it says, verse 2, she was there as a friend and as a servant to help the wedding go well. Notice verse 2 says, Jesus and his disciples were what? Invited to the wedding. So they were invitees. They were guests. They weren't there to serve at the wedding and to serve their friends. But it's important that we know that Mary was there out of her love, care, and concern and desire to serve this family that she knew and loved. Now, here's what happens. In verse 3, when they run out of wine, the mother of Jesus, notice it doesn't call her Mary, it says the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. So when she recognizes that they ran out of wine, and this is a crisis, because her friends are going to be shamed in the eyes of all of the attendees, she doesn't want her friends to be shamed. She doesn't want their honor to be diminished because they didn't plan well enough and they ran out of wine. So there's a major risk of being shamed. Her response out of love for this family is to go to Jesus with the problem. She knows some things about her son, and she's going out of a cultural reply, a cultural response to a crisis. Go to somebody who has the capacity to get you out of this situation. You see? And she knew that her son, you guys will like this, had utang na loob with her. Because she was his mother. Right? So there was a debt of gratitude, utang na loob, that Mary knew she had over her son. Because she was his mother. And for a number of other reasons, which we don't have time to get into. Are you with me so far? Okay. So, she goes and says, they have no wine. She tells Jesus. Now listen, in the English version, it's kind of harsh, but it wouldn't be in the original language that they were speaking in. He says, in verse 4, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? Now the word woman, in better English, would be ma'am. It's a respectful term for a woman that's older than you, that you acknowledge is important and has a certain status. It's the better English translation is, ma'am, what does this have to do with me? This is your concern, ma'am. Why are you throwing it onto me? It's not my time. The attention that will come on me, it's not time for that yet. There's a time for me to unveil myself. This is not that time. Okay? Very interesting. Now, here's where it gets very, very important and it's hard because I taught this in a number of churches around the country, and I train missionaries that are going to go serve overseas. This next part is hard for a person from a Western culture to understand. She does this. She says in verse 5, his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. That's the pivotal moment in the event. Basically, what she's doing is an Asian cultural trait of putting her face, you know what face is? Dignity, the honor, the respect that you're due as an individual, as part of a group, face. In America, we don't care much about face. But in Asian cultures, in collectivistic cultures, how you're viewed by other people matters to you. Your face. Yeah. In fact, I think my sister can bear witness to me, my sister from Thailand, or also here, can bear witness that in Thai, the language Thai, when you shame somebody, the actual Thai word is you've ripped their face off. You've done something and you've ripped their face off so that now anybody that looks at them will not see them with the proper dignity. You've caused them to lose face. We don't worry about that in Western culture. The rest of the world operates on a face-based basis. They're honor and shame cultures, you see. Very, very important to understand. One quick story. When we lived in Cebu, we lived in a subdivision outside of Cebu, outside of the city, near Mandaue. It was called Manila. And we lived in a subdivision, and there were a lot of fairly wealthy Filipinos that had bought property and built their house, and they were supposed to pay, after they bought property and they built their houses, they were supposed to pay like a homeowners association fee to pay for the guard, to pay for the gardening, homeowners association fee. Well, we rented a house in there, and from a very wealthy Spanish guy whose father was the mayor of Cebu right after World War II, Del Rosario family. And we rented the house, and we immediately started getting letters that were sent to all the other residents saying, you're not paying your homeowners association fees, right? All these somewhat wealthy Filipinos that were engineers and attorneys. One of our residents was General Bakay, who was the Region 9 guy at the time, who eventually became the ambassador to Vietnam from the Philippines, General Bakay. They weren't paying their homeowners association fee. Not because they didn't have the money, they just didn't pay it. So they kept writing these threatening letters, right? And if you don't pay your homeowners association fee, we're going to take legal action. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And nobody was even paying attention. Nobody responded to those things. A lot of these people writing the letters had been trained in America. They'd been to college over here. So they're using American legal threatening to get Filipinos to do the right thing, which never works. Okay? The threat of the law coming down on you it's not a Filipino cultural trait. Culture matters more than law. That's why there's the corruption and the graft that's found in the Philippines. Because there's not a rule of law, there's a rule of culture. And anytime law comes in conflict with culture, you always obey the culture. Right? Am I right?
Amen.
So you know what happened? They figured it out. There was a chalkboard right at the guard shack when you went into the subdivision, and one day after that letter came out, the fourth or fifth letter, the guard had written down the names of all the families and how much money they owed in homeowners fee. So Garcia family, 40,000 pesos. Yu family, 20,000 pesos. Gonzalez family, whatever. And I drove out, I was going to the church. Actually, I walked past that to get the jeepney to go downtown to the church. And I said, whoa, this is bad. Right? Sure enough, I come back in the afternoon, I get off the jeepney, and half of the names have been erased. They collected all the money. Why? Because they feared being shamed in the eyes of the fellow homeowners. When their debt was made public, the fear of seeing that they were the ones that letter was targeted for was greater than their fear of law, and they paid their bills. Very smart, right? Honor matters. Shame matters. Now, here's the pivotal point of this. When she says to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. That's the pivotal point, because what she's doing now, and this is another important thing, she's putting her face into the hands of her son. So now her son has to act to save her face. It sounds manipulative, and in some ways it is. But it's a very honor and shame-based culture decision. One of the things you learn when you're in Asia and things don't go right is yelling at the person behind the counter doesn't work. Raising your voice doesn't work.
That's right.
With Philippine Airlines especially. What you have to do is you have to take it and spin it to where, oh, I need you to help me. I'm in this country. I love the Philippines. Something that is very important to who I am is happening. Can you help me? Is there anything you can do? You put yourself in a position of dependence on someone else to save your face. And now, when they do that to save your face, you're now connected with them, and they've done something that raises their status in your eyes. Now, you guys don't think about it because it's part of your culture, but this happens all the time in Filipino culture, in Asian cultures. So when she says to the servants, whatever he says to you, just do it, she's put her face in his hands. Now he has to act. Because she's let it be known that she can do something about the situation. There's no line. Her friends are going to be shamed. They could be sued. She has the power to change that, to rescue them, and it's through her son. So now she says to the servants, now Jesus has to act to save his mother's face. It's a cultural tool. It's not sin. It's not wrong. It's the reality of the way God has wired us. See, Jesus saved the face of the Father. The death of Jesus saved God's face, according to Romans 3, where Paul says God passed over sin over and over and over and over until now Jesus died. Because until Jesus died, you could have pointed the finger at the Father and said, you say it's soul that sins will die. You're going to reap what you sow, but we don't see people. You know, you promised punishment immediately, but I don't see any punishment throughout history. So the death of Jesus on the cross, one of the things it did was it saved God's face. Very deep stuff. Hard to understand stuff. Very important. That's another subject. But follow the flow here. So now Jesus has to act. And this is what he does. He says to the servants, verse 6, there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, concerning 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus says to the servants, now, one other quick question. I was born and raised Catholic, American Catholic, which is very different than Asian Filipino Catholic, very different than Polish Catholic, Mexican Catholic, Brazilian Catholic. American Catholicism is very odd. It's not real Catholicism in most cases. Mary is not put at the same level of Jesus in American Catholicism. she is throughout the rest of the world in the different versions of the Catholic Church. So when people would ask me when I was there in the Philippines, well, you born agains don't like Mary. And I said, I love Mary. No, you don't respect Mary. Yes, in fact, I obey Mary. They go, you do? I said, yes, get your Bible, and I'll show you. So they go around their house and they try to find their Bible, and you pick it up, it's covered with dust. They blow it off. I say, now turn to John chapter 2. They can't find John chapter 2, right? So I help them in their Bibles, and I take them to this text. And I say, I love Mary. I respect Mary. She's the most, well, she is a blessed woman. Yeah. But it had nothing to do with her. God chose her to be his vessel. And I obey Mary. And I said, you know why I obey Mary? Because, listen, Mary says to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. See, Mary told the servants, whatever my son says to you, do it. So I obey Mary. She points other people to her son and says, whatever my son tells you to do, do it. So I listen to Mary. Mary says, listen to my son. I'm listening to her son, right? What does her son tell me to do? You must be born again. I go to John 3. See, that's how you do that. I'm not confronting. I'm just saying. I love Mary. Mary's cool. Mary's great. I obey Mary. Yeah. Mary says, do whatever my son says. Okay. I'm going to listen to her son. Her son says, you got to be born again. Okay. So Jesus says, verse 7, to the servants, go and fill up those water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. Now, the master of the feast is, the equivalent in America of the wedding coordinator. He's the one the family hires to put the whole to-do on. They provide the money. He makes everything work. So he's got an inside connection to the family that's putting on the wedding. Jesus says, fill those things up with water, and then take them to the master of the feast. So it's very simple. It says, draw some out, take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. I mean, very just like blunt to the point. When the master of the feast, now he didn't know they had run out of wine yet, right? The master of the feast, he's managing the whole evening, the whole thing. He's overseeing all of it, the food, the drinks, everything, the music, the entertainment. He's overseeing all of it. Paid very well by the family to manage the feast. He's the master of the feast. He doesn't know, because who would be the first to know they run out of wine? The servants. The common people that are just there as employees working. Just the mundane, blue-collar workers at the wedding are the first to know. Because Mary's working alongside them, she knows immediately they've run out of wine. That knowledge hasn't gotten to the master of the feast yet. She catches it immediately, says to Jesus, hey, they've run out of wine. What does that have to do with me, man? Really? Hey, whatever he tells you to do, just do it. He says, go do this. They go do it. The master of the feast doesn't know any of this is going on. Now we learn another cultural nugget here, right? The next cultural nugget is this. Verse 9, when the master of the feast tasted the water that was made wine, and he didn't know where it had come from, but the servants knew where it had come from. The master of the feast called the bridegroom, in other words, the guy that's getting married, and it would have been his parents there too. And he said, wow, everybody at the beginning sets out the good wine, the expensive wine is put out at the beginning. And then after everybody's a little tipsy, you switch out the good wine and put the cheap stuff in. The $2 chuck, right? You know what that is, the $2 chuck. Ripple, Gallo, Maria, Sangria, that kind of stuff. Okay. every other wedding I work, they put out the expensive wine at the beginning. And then when people are feeling the wine, they switch it to the cheaper wine to save money. And nobody knows because they're a little tipsy. This guy, this family, has actually saved the good wine, the good stuff, until now. That increases the family's honor in the eyes of the master of the feast. You see? Verse 10, every man, the master of the feast said, at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests are well drunk, then the inferior. You've kept the good wine until now. Wow. And then John says this beginning of signs, the first miracle Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed. You see, how was his glory manifested? Not because he turned water to wine, but because he covered shame. Very important to understand, this wedding was put on by the family. The primary goal was to raise their status, to increase their honor in the eyes of those that they cared about. They blew it. They didn't plan right. They didn't have enough money. They tried to be something they were not. They're in a situation now of shame that they deserve to be in. This is nobody's fault but theirs. They pretended to be something they're not. They made bad decisions. The consequences of their decisions are shame, dishonor, potential lawsuits. They have put themselves into that situation. Jesus enters into their chaos. They created the chaos. Jesus steps into the chaos they made. But what does he do? He hides their shame. He not only covers their shame, right, to save their honor. So it's not just that he covered their shame in the eyes of the people there so that they would preserve their honor. He took a step further than that. He increased their honor. He gave them more honor than they had when it started. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ for people from the Middle East, for people from Asia, for people from Africa. Every aspect of the gospel that matters to 90% of the people on this planet is in this first miracle. See, the first song, if I remember right, had some phrase of covered my shame. I can't remember what song it was, but it's in American songs all the time. Shame means nothing to Americans. Shame has no purpose in American life and culture. You have to understand that. Shame means something to Filipinos. To an individual, shame has no point or purpose. Look at the candidates running for president. There's no concept of shame. We used to have it, we lost it. We don't have an honor and shame-based culture anymore, except in the military. Military shame and honor matters. Okay? But every aspect of the gospel is here. You got yourself into a situation, you deserve shame. When we're born, we dishonor God. We violated his law. Yes, we're guilty of breaking the law, but even more, we've dishonored our Creator. We've lived in a way that shames him. We haven't represented him properly. Why do Filipino Asian families all want their kids to become doctors, lawyers, and engineers? Why? Because all of those careers will increase the honor of the family. So every Asian dreams of their kid being a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. Americans do not get that in any way, shape, or form. Because it's do whatever you want. Whatever's going to make you happy. That's not Asian. Do that which is going to honor your family. Make choices that will increase the status of your family in the eyes of those that matter to you, which is why you have conflict in Asian families. Some of you are experiencing it right now. You were raised in the Philippines, but your kids are being raised here. Clash in the family. You want your kids to act with the honor of the family in mind, and your kids are acting as if what they want is the most important thing in the world. I did a lot of counseling. I do a lot of counseling with Asian families over this issue. So I'll close with this. Jesus came into the chaos that we created. We dishonored God. We're in a condition of shame. See, shame, like guilt, is not just a condition. It's not just a feeling, it's a condition, right? Guilt is a feeling and a condition. On the way down from Mesquite, speed limit 75, I was driving 80. I didn't feel any guilt, but I was in a condition of guilt. I was in a condition of guilt. I'm violating the speed law. I don't feel it, but I'm guilty. When a cop pulls out, I slow down. Why? Because now I'm feeling it. So guilt is a condition and a feeling. You can be guilty and not feel it. Or you can feel guilty when there's no reason to feel guilty. I got a guilty conscience. Well, it's the same with shame. Shame is a condition and a feeling. In American culture, it's only a feeling. In Asian culture, in this culture, shame is a condition that Jesus came to take us out of. Not just to remove the feeling, but to remove us from the condition. He carried our shame because we were in a condition of shame. All of the aspects of the gospel in this first miracle, it's not about water and wine. And you guys know this by culture, by experience. The world needs to hear it from that angle. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this morning.